Chapter 3. She woke up in a chair. The first thing she noticed was that she couldn't move. The second thing she noticed was a man sitting in front of her. It was Sean, and he was tied up with rope. Ricky looked around and noticed they were in her living room. Sean was facing her in his chair, his chin resting on his chest. She tried to scream, to wake him, but her voice was muffled. She saw a big piece of duct tape over his mouth. She must have had a piece over her mouth as well. Footsteps to her right startled her. She saw the masked man approach from the adjoining kitchen, a large knife in his hands. He twirled it around, with the sharp point poking the index finger of his left hand. Ricky screamed and shook her head. She tried to plead with him, to beg him to stop. She knew why he was doing this, and if she could only talk to him. The man stood behind Sean and wrapped an arm across his chest, like he was hugging him. Sean stirred then, slowly waking up. The masked man caressed Sean's cheek with the knife. Ricky screamed again, and this time Sean seemed to hear it. He came fully awake and stared at her with wide eyes. Then he looked down at the other man's arm. Then he looked to his left, at the masked face. The man stood to full height and plunged the knife into Sean's left shoulder. Sean screamed. Ricky screamed. The man tilted his head to the side and stared at her. When he pulled the knife out, blood squirted out of the wound. Ricky started breathing heavily through her nose and feared she would pass out or suffocate. She jumped up and down in her chair, trying to loosen the ropes. Sean slowly came to his senses and stopped screaming, but he was clearly in pain. Sweat poured off his face in buckets. Ricky couldn't believe this was happening. It had to be a nightmare. She'd wanted to see the new horror sequel so badly, had dreamed about it for 11 years. She used to fear she would die before it was even made. This was just a nightmare. It was the day before the movie was to open. She would wake up in her bed. She would go to work. Then she would meet Sean at the theater. She knew that was all a load of shit. She wasn't dreaming, and all of this was very real. She heard Sean groan, so she looked at him. He looked weaker than he had a minute ago. She shook her head in apology. This was all her fault. The masked man wrapped his arm across Sean's chest again. Then he stabbed Sean in the stomach. Ricky screamed, and then she screamed again. She continued screaming as she watched Sean being stabbed to death. She couldn't stop herself from counting the number of stabbings. She lost count at 16. By then, Sean was dead. The killer seemed to notice this, so he stopped stabbing him and shoved the chair over. Sean's head hit the floor with a sickening thud. The killer kneeled down in front of Ricky and removed the tape from her mouth. "Tony, stop," she said, tears spilling from her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" He tilted his head to the other side and then removed the zombie mask. It was Tony. "How dare you ask me that?" he said through gritted teeth. "You ruined my life when you broke up with me, and then you parade this pretty boy around town?" He indicated Sean. "You must be out of your fucking mind." "I'm sorry, Tony," she replied, carefully working her hands out of the ropes that bound them. "I made a mistake breaking up with you. I know that. I've missed you, thought about calling you, but I was too scared." "Scared of what?" His dark, sunken eyes narrowed. He had a thin mustache, and the curly hair on his head was very thin. He looked old and young at the same time. "Scared you wouldn't forgive me," she said. Of course, she was lying, as most people would do in such a situation. She didn't know if he would believe her, but she knew she had to distract him. "Really?" he asked. He sounded like he believed her. "Yes. After the mistake I made, how could you not hate me? Her right hand slipped free. "I love you, Tony. I missed you. Now that Sean is out of the way, we can be together again." He smiled. It truly was a sweet smile, one of the things Ricky had liked about him. She didn't care for it now, though. Tony leaned forward, his eyes closed and his lips puckered. He kissed her, and as much as she didn't want to, she kissed him back. As they kissed, she reached for the knife. She'd seen it in his left hand as he took the tape off with his right. She felt the handle. Before Tony could notice, she snatched the knife out of his hand and stabbed him in the side of his face. He screamed and backed away, tripping over Sean's body. Ricky pulled at the rope across her chest until it was loose enough to slip out of. She ran into the garage and hopped into her car. She'd pressed the garage opener on the wall without even thinking about it, and by the time she had the car started, the door was halfway open. She backed out of the garage and immediately hit something. Sean's car. She'd forgotten he parked behind her. She screamed and cursed, ready to exit the car and run to a neighbor's, when she saw Tony run into the garage. Ricky put the car in first gear and stomped on the gas pedal. She rammed Tony directly into the wall in front of her. He screamed as blood shot out of his mouth. Ricky put the car in reverse and then back into first. She stomped on the pedal and rammed him again as he dropped to his knees. His head nearly exploded. She repeated the process again and again until there was nothing left of Tony's upper body.